Welcome to the Honeybee Watch Symposia series. We're excited for this first event in 2024. We have more than 120 people who have signed up. I'm Steve Rogenstein, I'm your host and the behind-the-scenes producer and Honeybee Watch's project director. And I'm joined today by Rigo Moro, who is our science director. And today is a special event for us, a departure from our usual format. We've partnered with the Arboreal Apiculture Salon to present the continuation of conversation they began in December, whereby 7 international beeliners met and talked about their projects and shared why this ancient craft is so important to their research. We sent that link to you for the Salon number 30, and hopefully some of you got to watch it because it contextualizes who they are, what their projects are about. And what we wanted to do is, instead of repeating all of that, give them a platform whereby they could talk even deeper about the topics that they did not get to cover earlier. Rigo, if you wouldn't mind dropping that link in for the Salon number 30. And when you see the link, it actually says Salon number 29. That's just an error. It's actually beelining. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Arboreal Apiculture Salon, it was founded in 2019 after the first Learning from the Bees conference by Michael and Cheyanna, 2 of our guests today, as well as Jonathan Powell from the Natural Beekeeping Trust. And the mission of the salon is to explore the science, beauty, and spiritual expression of arboreal apiculture and apiology. And just to clarify, in case you're not familiar already, arboreal apiculture pertains to bees living in trees, either within cavities or log hives. And the salon's an opportunity for the global arboreal apiculture community to meet and connect for symbiotic learning. And it serves as a resource to exchange innovative ideas, listen to, as well as chat with experts and enthusiasts from around the world. So Michael and Cheyanna, thank you for supporting today's symposium. So to put things in context, I'm going to just briefly introduce Honeybee Watch. If you'd like to see a more expansive introduction, on our resources page, the first video is an 8-minute long introduction to Honeybee Watch, which I presented during the first symposium last year. But just briefly, we're an international coalition tasked with better understanding how and why free-living honeybees survive via natural selection with little to no human intervention. And in the 4 years of our existence, our research partners and participating citizen scientists have identified more than 2,000 sites of free-living bees on 5 continents. And we're hopefully just about to get some from Africa. So Nina or anyone else who's in Africa, and if you know of any free-living bees, please participate, and then we'll be on all 6 continents. Obviously, bees are not on Antarctica. So also with Honeybee Watch, with these data points, we're collaborating with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, to reassess the red list status of Apis mellifera in Europe. And later this year, we're going to release an open access monitoring protocol to track the survival of an activity of free-living nests that partners and participants can use freely. If you'd like to know more about us, watch that presentation. Rigo, if you could just drop the resources page link in. And we also launched a new YouTube channel, which is also at the link that Rigo is going to drop in. So just a little bit about the Symposia series. We launched it last year with a number of objectives. First of all, to build this network, the Honeybee Watch network, and really to bring experts together, like our 4 guests today, introduce them to one another if they don't already know one another, introduce you to them and you to one another, because we really do encourage this cross-pollination and exchange of ideas and data and resources. It's also a platform whereby we can hear from different perspectives, expertise, and experiences, discuss these individual issues. Last year, we talked about monitoring, data rights and data sharing, as well as what it means to be wild. And this year, we're talking obviously today about beelining, tree cavities. I see Mick is here. He's going to be our guest in June. Wild bees. And the fourth one in December is communicating and recruiting for citizen science. So that takes us to today's symposium, which is titled Beelining, Modern Day Makeover of an Age-Old Craft. For those of you who are new to this term beelining, which is also known as bee hunting, it's the act of searching for bees' homes by patiently, or sometimes very tediously, by finding foragers, enticing them with a food source, marking them with a colorful dot, and then tracking them where they fly. And by repeating this process and following the beelining, they may possibly lead you home or to an apiary, which happens, unfortunately, regularly. So our four guests have spent hours upon hours waiting for bees to reveal their nests, and we're grateful that they've joined us today. They'll share anecdotes, best practices, hazards to avoid, and advice on how we too can beeline. Unlike other symposia, we'll follow a different format. It's just a basic panel discussion for about a little more than an hour, and then followed by the Q&A. Again, if you have questions, write them in the chat. And then, without further ado, I'm going to introduce all of our guests at once, and then we're going to start. So I'm not going to read their bios. You can see that on our website. Instead, I'll briefly try to contextualize their research and how we came to meet some of our guests. Starting with Tom Seeley, who probably needs no introduction, but I will nonetheless. He worked at Cornell University for more than 40 years, teaching animal behavior and researching wild honeybees in the Arnott Forest, which covers more than 4,200 acres in central New York in the United States. Among a ton of accomplishments, he's written 6 seminal books, one of which is fast becoming the standard for beelining, called Following the Wild Bees. And next month, he's readying to release his next book, Piping Hot Bees and Boisterous Buzz Runners, 20 Mysteries of Honeybee Behavior Solved, which you can pre-order at Princeton University Press. And Rigo just put in the link right there. So thank you, Tom, for being with us today. Our next 2 guests are Thiele and Cheyanna, both of whom work at Apis Arborea. If you could drop that link in there, Rigo. And with Jonathan Powell, the 3 of them co-host the Arboreal Apiculture Salon. In 2017, Michael founded Apis Arborea to create new pathways of apiology and to promote the use of a holistic system and science-based framework when working with bees. Then in 2021, Cheyanna joined the team as program director, and together they advocate for tree beekeeping. They offer workshops, they consult to various organizations, and along with a team of 6 of us, including myself, we are producing the next Learning from the Bees conference in the United States in 2025. So that's super exciting for us. Stay tuned. They're also researching a 3,700-acre nature preserve in Northern California, which is surrounded by tens of thousands of privately owned wildlands. And there they've been using beelining to find and then monitor free-living bees. And since 2021, they've located about 36 nests and believe that they've identified 15 more beelines, although they have not yet found those nests. So thank you, Michael and Cheyanna. Our next guest, Joe Ibbertson, has been a treatment-free beekeeper for 13 years. For the last 4 years, like Tom, Michael, and Cheyanna, he's been using beelining and tracking and researching free-living honeybees at an enormous estate called Boughton Estate in the UK, which is situated on about 3,500 acres of forests, a lot of which are ancient oak trees that are maybe 800 years old. And he's so far found more than 130 nests, of which he's monitoring about 80 of them. So thank you, Joe, for being here. So as you can see, there's a lot of experience and knowledge here massed in this panel, and we're super excited to hear our guests from them. So let's dive in. I'd like to begin on a lighter side and hope that you can share one or two anecdotes of either the funniest, the scariest, the most surprising or dangerous or memorable experiences while beelining. Don't be shy.
Shall I go first?
Yes, please, Joe.
Oh,
The awkward silence.
Yeah, I didn't know where to go when you said maybe we should introduce ourselves with an anecdote. So I've kind of got two. One, the most recent one reminded me of something that had happened last year. So recently I got into a conversation with a Kenyan beekeeper, and it's nice to see some Kenyan representation today. And they basically seen an advertisement in the Thorns magazine for the bee gym. And if you don't know what a bee gym is, it's a little plastic contraption, and your bees are going to crawl through it and dislodge mites, and it encourages hygienic behavior. And it's rubbish, a bit superstitious if you ask me. But she was essentially laughing at the fact that our bees in the Western world were so useless that they had to have a gym to work out to be strong enough to defend themselves against Varroa. But that connected me there with the fact that she is so used to bees being in nature, and that their bees are resilient from being in nature. The whole idea of bee gym was completely ridiculous. And what this made me think of was that last year I was at the BBKA, the British Beekeepers Spring Convention. I was part of a talk with Professor Stephen Martin there about Varroa-resistant bees. And you've got plenty of time to kill at these things. I'm not interested in all the stalls and things like that. I'm more of a natural beekeeper myself. So I took a stroll, and I went out and I found a beeline. And I found this poignant because, you know, we're talking about beelining, and 99% of the time people use their boxes and they get bees to come to them. And essentially I do the same thing, but I don't use a box. I never have. And I'm hoping what comes across today in these talks is our relationship with nature. Because when I had gone out for that walk, I came across a beeline, and I was able to discern the minutiae of what was happening there, the fact they were flying away from certain foragers, the rate of flight. And it was more that, to me, was a dawning of realization that I was looking at things in a greater connection to nature and bees' interaction with nature and what was going on around them. And I hope that comes across today. The second thing that it made me realize was that I really like pork and applesauce rolls as well. And if I can take anything from that convention, pork and applesauce rolls are beautiful. So yeah, that was my anecdote.
Leaving it to Joe to end on a funny note. Thank you. Mikhail, Tom, Cheyanna?
Well, since Joe ended on pork and applesauce, I'll pick up where you left off. It's interesting thinking about an anecdote or a story, or there's so many memorable moments out in the wild and with the bees and really the greater field of nature. But I have to say, one of my favorite memories from the first year that Mikael and I started beelining, and to out ourselves as dorks, we didn't have the right gear, and we were trying all sorts of ridiculous things that we wouldn't recommend you trying now on your own. One of which was bicycling into a remote area in the heat of the summer and early morning to beeline in a remote part of the Galbraith Preserve. And we had the startling early morning experience of scaring a wild herd of boar that were down in the creek bed. So the other side of the pork and applesauce is the encounters with wildlife out there and the wild nature that's so much more than just searching for bees. And I think that's been one of the joys and one of the frustrations for me with beekeeping is these moments of having the opportunity to really feel nature in its wild interconnected relationships, and to moments of bees flying all around and feeling some sort of communication that they're wanting to convey, or where are they, and then also that often challenging and frustrating place where I realized just how very kind of dense and human and disconnected my senses are from not living in this continuous relationship with nature all of the time. And so there's this combination of wonderful aha moments where something is revealed, and then other times where that quality of observation and relationship feel very like room to work. But I would say the moment of, being hot and exhausted at the end of the day, going, we've got 20 minutes left. Are we either going to give it up, or does, kind of almost praying to the greater bee gods to be like, are you going to reveal yourself? Okay, let us bow and humble ourselves at your feet. In those moments when then all of a sudden you see them and they may have been right there all along, or you're looking around and you realize that you're standing with your back to the bee tree that's literally about head height and it could, run right into you. So I guess to say that, in the midst of sharing all of the techniques and lovely moments, or here's how to, that one of the things that I would hope to convey is this sense of how can you enter into landscape and to the wild with this open heart and an invitation for this great mysterious being that is the honeybee, and all of her friends that she lives out there with, to touch you in a way and bring a moment of awe and inspiration, and show you something grander. So I'll leave it with that.
And I should have known better that the anecdotes that you would share would be wrapped up in nuggets of wisdom. So thank you to both of you. Tom, Mikael?
I'd like to step in at this point to build on what was just said. I think one of the very special things about bee hunting, one of the features of it, is that it's unlike beekeeping. When you're beekeeping, you're dealing with thousands of the bees in front of you on a frame or whatever, or the whole hive. When you're bee hunting, you're dealing with a handful of worker bees, and often you'll label them for individual identification. So it gives you a very different relationship with honeybees. You're looking at a few bees at a time. You're taking notes on when they're coming and going, where they're going off. And you learn that some are very nervous and some are very calm, some are very quick, some are very slow. You really get a sense in a way that you really don't at all as a beekeeper, a sense of the individual variation. And I guess there's one other thing I'll mention now quickly. In the books that are written on this subject, which are really fun to read, I'd say, it's usually the process of starting a beeline is usually described as capturing bees off of a flower or finding them at a water source. And those are usually the usual effective ways to do it. But I want to mention that I've stumbled upon a second way that works really well when there are no flowers. And this I encountered in our fall season in October. All the frosts had killed off all the flowers. But what I did is I got some old combs with some honey in them, and I burned them on top of a garbage can, actually, inverted garbage can. And it was amazing. That aroma attracted bees, worker bees, flying upwind to it, like it was an incredible magnet to them. I think it was the aroma of the honey. And it led to finding a bee tree that was only about 300 meters away, but I would never have made contact if I hadn't burned those combs, I think. So there's just a few thoughts to start.
Thank you, Tom. And Mikael?
Well, I'm the caboose. Yeah, I mean, it's very inspiring to listen to the three of you, and probably it's getting very obvious to everybody else that it's very rich. There's endless stories to share and to tell. And when it comes to anecdote and things like that, well, I want to come back briefly to wildlife, and where we mostly work at Galbraith, we have lions there, mountain lions and bears. And I remember the caretaker who has some wildlife cameras shares sometimes with us what he finds on those cameras. And there was a day where it showed actually Cheyanna and I and others, volunteers, walking by in front of a wildlife camera. And just 2 hours later, a mountain lion walked by. Mm. And not only that was interesting, but also to realize how tall those lions are. That was quite impressive. And it is interesting. Sometimes we go there by oneself alone, and it is an interesting feeling to as an apex predator to all of a sudden have this experience some moments of becoming prey oneself. So even though the likelihood of having an encounter with a mountain lion is less likely than to be struck by lightning, but sometimes it doesn't feel like that once one is out there by oneself. So another story coming to mind is from last year. We were beelining, and we have sometimes instances that have very much the feeling of a Bermuda Triangle. That's how we refer to those places where we have gone to multiple times, even over multiple years, and still were not able to locate that tree. And so that was the second year we had gone back to that area. We had on the first day multiple lines on that table, and at some point had to decide which one to pick to venture towards to. And we picked a line, and it's very steep terrain at Galbraith, and we could not find that location on the first day. And then 2 days, and at the end of the day, one of us walked and had a sense of being really close, but we had to call it. It was too late. We had to go home. 2 days later, we went back to the same location and resumed and followed again that line. And after an hour or two, it was at that moment, it was me reaching the ridge and looking, hearing, but I couldn't find a tree that would have qualified as a possible nest. And I kept looking, and well, what I found was a swarm of bees hanging on a thin limb of a dark fir that was on our beelining table. And it must have been there for at least 3 days, because it was there 2 days earlier, and it was that same day hanging there. And so that was a very big surprise, that swarms would come to beelining tables, and that the size of that swarm was quite impressive. It was very large. And it was then also an interesting question or interesting fact, that we could witness a swarm of that size hanging in the same location for at least 3 days in a quite wild landscape that that has several nest site options for them to consider and to move into. So, and maybe one last thing, and that is, throughout those years we have been beelining, what was always true, it has been always true, is to be very open to changing plans and directions. You know, so often we would have gone with a certain plan. Oh, we do this and this and this in that area, and in driving in, you stop for a moment and roll down the car window, and a bee moves into the car. It's like, oh, maybe we'll beeline here today. So this openness of continuously staying open to dropping everything and moving into a different direction is quite something that we found to be very important.
Mikhail, did you call it Bermuda Triangle or Bermuda?
Yes, Bermuda. Bermuda, meaning
Bermuda.
Oh,
yeah. Kind of like Keith saying be-lioning. So
you're
just
so good, Steve.
I'm not so punny. Haha.
Me-
So Rigo had a good idea. He's going to pin all of our panelists to the top of the boards so that when people see that their grid has shifted, he has manually done that. So sorry to jar you if you weren't expecting that. Cheyanna, did you want to say something?
Well, just on the lion, I was wanting to ask Mikhail, this is not one of our stories directly, but the caretaker out there at Galbraith, didn't he have a mountain lion jump out of a tree very near him and then also found a bee tree right in that? Can you expand on that story? He didn't tell me directly.
Yeah, well, that is true. That happened last month, I believe, and he was hiking through this rugged terrain, and all of a sudden saw 3 deer, and they started running, and then he looked up and he saw a mountain lion leaping from 20 feet of height out of a tree towards one of those deer. The mountain lion missed. And that was all happening like 70 feet away from Andy. And that was a deep experience of its own kind, and also a first for him.
Can I ask, am I the only one that goes out without a plan? Does everybody you know what I mean? We all have to start somewhere. We pick a spot, all that kind of thing. I generally 99% of the time will just turn up and off I go. I think because I don't use a box, I've got nothing to anchor me. I will take off. So is there anybody else that doesn't work with the plan? Does anybody just drive around and think, or walk around and just think, right here, this is where I'm going to go today? Or how do you guys?
Well, from what I understand, Joe, you're the bee whisperer. Like, you just found one yesterday. We're part of a WhatsApp group, and it's just, I found another one today, and I found another one today, and that's Joe.
Well, it's also a little bit dependent on the landscape we're moving in. Like, for example, Connor, who works for us, just went to the JC in town, and within an hour found 4 nests and tall, big oak trees within an hour. Like, wow. Yeah. And that it really depends on the layout of the landscape we move in. And in our case, Galbraith is rugged, steep, dense forest, and it's very different from other landscapes. Like when we visited Blenheim in the UK, it has a very different layout. You can have long vistas and tall old trees. The conditions are different.
Well, and I would also say, to answer or respond to that question, Joe, it's kind of a funny thing. I'm continually fascinated by this human and other than human dynamic, right? So often we'll look at the landscape and we'll think, well, how about we check out and explore this area? And half the time we get halfway there or something else. And as Mikhail says, something else will catch our attention. And the whole plans that we might have, spent some time preparing beforehand get thrown out the window anyways. And it's an interesting dynamic to be playing with. Well, how do you have some idea of where to approach or how to build on the work that you've done in the past? But then always when I'm out there in the landscape, I'm holding those thoughts of what I have thought might work, but then looking around and going, well, where are the bees showing their presence today? We might have thought, oh, we're going to go over here, but then we walk past a very rich clump of forage that might change our direction entirely, or how we started working with water foragers, partly because that's where we found them in the environment. So it's this interesting dance, I think, between trying to figure something out and then listening to what's happening.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in how Tom does it, because as a scientist, there's the potential there that you're I've got a set methodology, but I don't know, you might just turn up somewhere and take a walk and think this is a good place, or what forage is going. I don't know what's your selection for starting off?
Thanks for asking that question, Joe. For me, it's almost, I go bee hunting almost always in the context of doing some scientific project. For example, learning the density of colonies, wild colonies in a particular forest, preserve, or just finding a number of wild free-living colonies so that I can monitor their survival and persistence, and also the attributes of their nest sites. So yeah, for me, it has been mostly in the context of addressing some mystery about how honeybees live in the wild. But that doesn't undermine at all the fun of it. But it does mean that I have to I guess I do have to, I usually do it in the context of a larger project. And it's, but sometimes I do just, occasionally I'll just go out and have fun, or I'll help another person who's trying to learn the craft. And then that's fun too.
Do you
so-
find that novices will lead you directions that you wouldn't normally have gone, or do you kind of overshadow them a bit? How do you work that?
Oh yes, that's a really key feature of bee hunting. You go where the bees are going, and that are often places that you did not intend to go to, and yeah, and that's a really important point. I'm really glad you raised that, because it's not like taking a hike, it's like taking a hunt, and you're tracking these bees back to their home.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I want to build on a point, one of the points that Makeover made, that the bees sometimes, the colony is not in where you would think colonies would normally be nesting. And I'll give one example where we're in the part of the world where I live, they're almost always living inside a pretty good sized tree, usually a hardwood. But one day I was doing a hunt, and I had to shoot across a swamp and went into some woods. And I went into a patch of woods where there just were no large trees, and there were no rock outcrops either. And I was thinking, where have the bees found a home in this patch of the forest? So I did what's called cross-lining and backlining. And it finally became clear to me that all the lines were pointing at one tall hemlock tree. But it wasn't a large diameter hemlock. It was only about 30 centimeters in diameter at the base. But then when I got underneath that hemlock tree and I looked up, I could see that there was a nest built in the branches up there. This poor colony had somehow got itself in a situation where it was nesting in the open. And maybe that's what also one of the other people had described. So you sometimes get really surprised, delightfully so, about when at the moment of finding the colony's location.
So,
But along your question, yeah, for me, it's usually it's part of a focused project.
so I came with a plan, and it's already been scrapped. So I'm gonna go with the flow. Tom, you have referenced cross-lining before, and you just mentioned backlining, two terms that I'm not too familiar with. Could you just quickly explain what that means?
Yeah, the cross-lining, I'll start with that one. You've got bees, a bunch of bees, and you've got a really good sense of what direction they're going. But if their round trip times are very, very long, sometimes what I'll do is I'll load up a bunch of bees on the comb in my bee box, and then I'll carry them off to the side to a point where it's, I don't know, 100 yards, 200 yards to the side of the line that they were flying off on, and then I'll let them out. And these bees are sufficiently adaptable that they'll realize that they're in an unusual spot, not where they were before, but they'll find their way home, and then some of them, not all of them, will come back to your new location. And then you get readings on the angle, that the compass direction that they're flying off. And then you can cross line, and then you can move to a place that's pretty close to where they are. It speeds up the hunt. And for this, of course, you really need to have a good map of the area. I use topographical maps. I don't sure what they call them in the UK, ordnance survey maps maybe, but that's one of the tools that I found very, very helpful, is having a very good map of the region, a fine scale map of where you're doing your bee hunting.
I'm interested that you clarified that and your methodology. Simply because I don't use the box. And what I do is something similar. Is I move from forage source to forage source. So there's always they seem to forage in capacity at one spot, and then they'll move on to another, and they're not always just on the same.
Quickly.
Well, who was that? So although I don't use a box, it's a similar technique. Bees being bees, they do the same kind of thing. So I work in a similar pattern. So I'm glad you clarified that and brought that up. But something that struck my mind when both you and Michael and Cheyanna have been talking, you mentioning different colonies and multiple lines and stuff like that. And I think there's a temptation to be to get locked into the thought that possibly there's only one colony, when often you get multiple colonies.
Yeah. Oh yes, that's true.
I'm interested to see, because I use the really strong place that I see inter-colony interaction is over nesting sites. So when the swarming seasons come around, there's always competition between colonies to get into a nesting cavity. So you see the hawking behaviors, and you see them guarding, and sometimes they'll camp there overnight, and just to make sure a different colony doesn't get there before they do. You guys must see that on the combs. I mean, I know because I've seen it as well, but do you guys see that behavior on your combs? Does it help you identify how many colonies you've got coming to your nectar source? How do you do that? How do you work that? How do you differentiate between
I do have each individual that's visiting my comb labeled with paint marks for individual identification. So yes, it does become the situation that sometimes there will be bees flying off in 2 or maybe even 3 different directions. Curiously, I don't see much conflict at the comb, because I think it's because they're in robbing mode, and it's first come, first serve, I think, in robbing, and there's a lot of food. So I don't see much fighting, and I simplify the situation by moving down the line towards the closest bee tree. And usually that helps the colony that I'm zeroing in on. It helps that colony dominate the comb eventually.
So you're differentiating strictly by bee lines then from your comb?
Yes, that's right. And for that, it's very important to choose a pretty open location to start your bee hunt, so you can get good sightings of their vanishing bearings.
Yeah, similarly, I have the same thing. I'll find a forage source, whatever it is, nectar, pollen, water, and you can see, if you stand back, you can see which direction the bees are coming from or which direction they're leaving in, and you can tell if you've got multiple lines coming from that location. Often I just pick which is the strongest, because I know they're going to be relatively close and
very good
and easier to spot, and I hedge my bets that way. It's interesting for me because I don't use a box. I can see how you guys are doing things and relate that to me.
So Joe, this is interesting to me. So you're not labeling individuals and timing them, or are you, to get a sense of who's fast?
Kind of. It's just experience. Experience is because I've just watched so many colonies now. I get an idea of how many bees are flying. What's a busy bee line? How many bees would I be seeing at water or at nectar, or and it depends. I'm very much about your local knowledge and working with your local environment and looking at things that way. What's going on in the world around them. So, for example, this time of year, either end of the year, spring and autumn, you'll see different behaviors, because here we have ivy, which is a huge source of pollen and nectar for the colonies. And you'll see tons and tons of foraging on them. But at the start of the year, a lot of the tree colonies here, particularly, will have smaller cavities, and they are often still a lot more well provisioned than a managed colony. So you can kind of tell, depending on the strength of the bee line and what they're going for. For example, the colony I found yesterday was hitting only pollen. It wasn't going for the blackthorn at all. It was going for the willow tree and only collecting pollen. So that, to me, is an instant, this colony is well provisioned. They're not looking at nectar. All they're looking at is rearing brood. So to me, it's a suggestion. It's just a possibility, a probability that they're well provisioned. And most managed colonies, because they have excess comb, larger containers and things like that, they'd be straight on for the nectar as well as the pollen, but they'd be stronger for the nectar. So to me, tiny little signs like that give me clues as to what kind of a colony is going foraging, what kind of strength the beeline should be. You know, cool weather, you would only see 1 or 2 bees. You know, like you were saying, Tom, you're literally working with a handful of bees. Sometimes it's just 1 or 2 bees that you'll see, and if they're flying at quite a distance, they can get cold in cool weather and they'll stop for a rest in the sunshine. And if you see pollen on them, well, you know they're only going one way with pollen. They're not taking it back to the tree. So, you know, it's tiny little clues like that, little nuances that I pick up on.
It is so fascinating to listen to you, Joe, to see that there are really so many ways of beelining, and really it comes back to where and what does our bioregion look like, and our familiarity with our bioregion, and then really to be very open and not to feel restricted by rules, because it is so tempting to make up rules. And I want to come back to what you and Tom were talking about lines, how yes, there may be multiple lines on the table, but there are ways of strategizing. And we haven't talked so much about water foragers yet, but for example, when it comes to water foragers, that is a very different cosmology of beelining almost, because the moment we come to water foragers, the initial rule we made up was, if we start on water foragers, it's only 1 nest, and it is as close as possible. The nest is as close as possible to that particular water source. Well, we found out that is not always true. But what is true is that by choosing water foragers, one can really zoom into 1 nest, and very likely the nest is very close. And I thought, Steve, maybe this is a good time just to show for a moment, share this 2-minute clip. Were you thinking that too?
Exactly, because Joe, you keep saying I don't use the box, and I just wanted to share with people what is the box. So, Mikhail, if you would like to share your screen.
Yeah. So it's just a very short video we use in our presentations. I'm sharing my screen, and can you still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And then here we go. And it's a little bit narrated. You can, maybe I'm not saying anything. It's one of those boxes, I think, was built according to Tom's directions, if I'm not mistaken here. So this is what
looks good.
That's the box we use. And the first part of the video goes around the box, explains how it looks like, how it works. And then the second half shows a little bit, tells the story of working with water foragers and finding the tree. Here we go.
There are different designs for bee boxes. This is one version. Any kind of bee box has 2 compartments, one front, one back, with a divider. And the idea is to fetch bees off flowers or water feeding stations with this side, to close it and then expose them to light. Here's a little piece of glass in there. Once they're in this, on the right side, we can close the divider and start all over.
So this is where we are working with water foragers. Right now, we're just observing.
Oh, there's one taking off. Another one is taking off.
And water foragers are beautiful. They fly direct, very direct. And so we fetched a few, and now initial release. We have maybe 3-4 bees that we are releasing. And that was a moment where we worked with volunteers. That's Andrea's first time of marking a bee with some watercolors.
That's good, that's good.
And we're using some plastic comb instead of...
Yes, I got a blue abdomen and a blue thorax.
Good.
I got a yellow abdomen.
And then it can get very busy on the comb. And here, maybe I'll stop the video for a second if I can, to show you what we did. Here, the beelining 93022. Those are our beelines we have. The tree number 22 we found later that day. It's about 100 meters apart, and it's steep, very, very steep terrain. And it took probably 2-3 hours to find that tree.
Can I ask what time of year were you doing it?
Yeah, dark comb.
That was September, right? That's September. And then we found it. It's in this dark fir at maybe 12 feet above ground level. And there was this younger tree next to it we could climb to get closer.
Good work.
Nice.
Very nice.
So what's the weather like in that area on an annual basis? Do you have very distinct seasons? Is it dry all year? Is it, is it a wet season, warm season? Is it cold, warm? What's the kind of climatic conditions?
It's not far
Yeah.
off of the coast, so there'll definitely be kind of coastal weather patterns, although it's mountainous terrain, so it doesn't really sock in with the fog there, but definitely very rainy, cold winter months, sometimes snow. Last winter there was snow up there. Typical kind of range of it, I would say a shorter springtime, and then by mid-June or so we start to get pretty dry and hot, and then everything dries out, the grasses turn brown. It's sometimes in the upper 90s, and it'll stay that way. And by the end of the fall season, of course, we have a fire season here too, where everything can get really dry and crispy, and even a lot of the smaller waterways and tributaries that are happening during the summer month or the winter months dry up entirely by the end of the summer season. So quite dry and hot, and then roughly sometime late October, early November, hopefully we start getting the rains again and everything starts greening up and replenishing.
Yeah, so it's not too dissimilar to here. So, well,
Yeah,
it just interests me because, I see the predominance of water collection very strong in spring, obviously very strong in summer when there's dearths and it's hot and things like that. But towards the autumn, the end of the year, it's not really much of a, you wouldn't be able to tell a great deal. So it's interesting that in your area that September was very successful for collecting for getting water forages.
We beeline actually from April all the way through almost the beginning of November.
Really?
And that's what it is. And and in terms of water foragers, there is a way, and we have done it before, where we don't even use the box for water foragers, but we just mark them. They're markable while foraging for drinking, and to mark, and then it gives us not only the direction in which they fly to locate the tree, but also a sense for distance, because we can time them. And that, speaking of rules, it's just an indication for distance, but it's not very exact.
yeah. And with the water foragers too, one thing that's coming up is there was one spring that Mikael went, and there were a lot of small mud puddles in the road that were these, very shallow, much warmer than the rushing river streams that we're going through. And that was a very fascinating time, that April. I heard all about the mud puddles for a couple sessions because I can't go quite as often, but it was incredible because just that observation for that point in the spring then gave us data and potentials to work from in the landscape for a lot of the rest of the season, which was really kind of fun. That mud puddle site gave us information about, that we found later on foragers and we're able to beeline off of. The other thing with water foragers that I found fascinating is one, it's a more spread out area that you're watching for bees if you're trying to mark them than just the little tiny comb on the table. However, One particular bee that's, red abdomen, you get to know her, she tends to come back to a very, very close same spot every time she's water foraging. So that's, it might be a bank that's spread out. If you have 2 or 3 people, each person may be kind of watching a small little quadrant, where, they've got their green and their yellow abdomens that are coming back. And then further down the bank that's where red and blue abdomen come to water. So that can be quite interesting to see what's going on.
And sometimes they come really back to the same pebble. I remember this one afternoon, I called her Bluey because she had the blue marked abdomen, and Bluey was come back every 3.5 minutes and right to the next pebble. And you could count on her. It was like, oh yeah, we still didn't find the tree that day, but Bluey was there, and it was lovely to be with her there.
Could I add something here about the noisiness of the information that the bees are providing, especially with respect to distance? I found a way to get around that, and that is I label bees for individual identification, and then I make a table for a number of trips for each bee, how long it takes her to go away and then come back. And some are very quick and consistent, and others are very slow and noisy. And so I just focus on the information I'm getting from the bees that are working very quickly and consistently. And then with that, if you look in this book, there's a nice little chart in here that relates the short away times to the distance to their home. And I find I can get that down to about 100 meters with precision. And so you can actually get, if you have a bunch of bees and you find some that are very consistent in their away times, you can get very good distance information as well as good direction information.
I just want to ask, is that following the wild bees?
Yeah, this book is following the wild bees. It's got it. Yep.
Rigo, can you drop the link for that, please, in the chat?
Tom, I
There you
love
go.
that you mentioned this piece too about watching the different personalities and the ones that are very consistent versus not. And it was interesting in watching some of that as well to then look a little bit closer at the bee. And, sometimes I've been able to be like, oh, she's a dear old forager who's been out and she's a bit tattered. So she's got her kind of geriatric timing versus the young, very efficient one, or, so sometimes you can tell that I've been able to see the differences in age a little bit with them, and other times not. So that subtlety of personality and the way they go about their job is really fascinating to see.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because Cheyanna, because you get to know these individuals, these bees as individuals, and just as you said, you'll see some that have been working pretty consistently, but then they start delaying when they take off to go home, and then their away times get a little longer, and then everything they do starts slowing down, and eventually I've even seen one fly off and then crash. It was the end of her life. So you really do get to know these bees as individuals, and you get to appreciate their variation in their work ethic, and also their, I don't know, just their peppiness.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, I have a question for you. When we beeline and let's say we have a return time of 6-7 minutes, we don't feel drawn to follow that line because it seems far away. But in your book, you talk about 10-minute returns. Where is your cutoff? Where would you say we are too far away, or would you anyway go for it?
And by return time, that's your term that I call for the away time, the time when she leaves.
Yes.
It all depends, Mikhail. If I just use what's ever the shortest, and sometimes that'll be 6 minutes, which means the tree is within, I don't know, a couple hundred yards. But sometimes I've had to work with bees that had away times. The shortest away times were 10 or 12 minutes. And you just make the best. You make the best with what you've got. That's at least in my experience. And I really envy, I very much envy, Joe, your situation, because I think you're working in that estate where it's pretty wide open and the trees are widely spaced and things like
No,
that, or not?
it's not at all. I mean, they've got some areas where sections have been felled because it's a managed forest, and they've got areas that are under preservation and all kinds of things. So it's very varying. But one of the reasons I didn't use the bee lining box was because I was having bees coming to me, and they would leave the box, and I was getting good timings. In fact, if I can share my screen, this is the very first time, and this was Patsy, our educations officer, and if some people might recognize that guy, Philippe Solbany, and we were having the bees coming up and taking the nectar and flying off, and then but they would follow avenues and then disappear. You need a strong bearing in a straight line, and if a bee flies 50 yards and turns left, you've lost that bearing. I know your answer to that would be to follow up to that junction, start beelining from there, and then to move on. But because the forests are heavily, a lot of the sections are quite dense. There's brambles, chest height, heavy foliage. You can't follow them. It's not. It doesn't. Sorry, you can't follow them with a box. It just didn't work out that way. So, sorry,
Joe, you moved the feeding station down the line, so sort of to get clarity about the direction, or if you see them flying around a tree to get a clear picture of the real direction to their home.
Yeah, what was it? A friend sent me the word of it, komorebi, which I think is a Japanese word, which you're basically looking at the light coming through the trees. There's those shafts of light that shine down. You can see the bees crossing through them. And like I mentioned earlier, I will shift from forage source to forage source. And that was something I wanted to ask you guys. You've covered the nectar, and you've covered the water. Has anybody used, and I posed this last time we spoke, but I'm asking this because I found a colony yesterday using pollen as its source. So has anybody used pollen? Do you guys, is it ever come up? Have you ever given it a whirl? Has that happened?
I don't provide a pollen source and thus track down pollen foragers, but I will often, using the bee box, snag a pollen forager and introduce her to world's best nectar source.
Job change.
Job change, right.
Oh, that's great.
And in Galbraith, a lot of the pollen source is in the trees. So, there'll be times. I have to say, quite honestly, when Steve asked me if I wanted to speak on the symposium, I'm like, well, I could come on and talk about how delightful and maddening it is, this experience that I have where it's I go so much more for myself with being in the landscape and trying to open my senses and perceive and track. So I'm very fascinated about your work, Joe, with how you follow them. That just kind of starts from this more organic place to begin with, but often I'll be somewhere and it's like the whole forest sounds like it's buzzing, or when I feel like I'm getting close to them, it's like, is that bees in the trees that are just foraging because we have a lot of the oak and things like that? Or am I hearing them, or quite what's happening here? It can feel a little bit like a sensory other world sort of place. And I remember one of the times I was out, Mikhail was not with me on that trip. I was just with a volunteer, and that was the first time for that for me. And we had an area that had quite a number of different beelines. We knew there were a lot of trees in that area. And so I decided to just play around. I got my pendulum out, and I was dowsing because I couldn't figure out what I was reading, and asking like, well, which direction? And so I kind of started to even use that as a following mechanism to see, is there some other kind of magnetic honing device towards where they're at? And toward the end of the day, it was taking me into this patch of forest that had tiny trees, maybe only,
Mhm.
what is that, 8 to 10 inches in diameter. I thought, well, there's no bee tree here. But I thought, well, I'll just walk up this little road to the top of the hill and see where there might be another spot to pick up again on a fresh day. And I turned around and was standing at a rock outcrop to look at the view of the little gully that we had been working in. And all of a sudden, the evening light, and this is after I had finally just let go of the searching, you know, I've given up. Okay, you've won. And then there's a glint. And then 35 feet off the ground, just at the edge of eyesight, in the top of a tree that the branches were like this big around, little tiny.
Yeah.
There they are. And they go, haha, okay, now you can see us.
Yeah.
So I don't know, a little secondary anecdote story that's, yeah.
No, that's a lot of the time. That's how it happens. You have to be in the right place and time to see them, and that's essentially what we're doing. Although, you know, I keep saying it, I don't have the box, but what you guys are doing to start with and to finish with, you've still got to find the colony when you've got a distance and direction. Keith posted a question a second ago: did they fly up a street and then turn left? I think we should probably all expand on that. Honeybees fly the most efficient route, depending on the conditions and the environment. They don't always fly in a straight line. So often in forests or open ground, if there's landscape in the way, they will fly the most efficient route for them. And that isn't always in a straight line. So the bees that I was tracking that particular day were using a roadway, a track, and then turning in to the forest where there was a clearing between the trees. And that was just to conserve energy rather than flying all the way up and over the canopy. They didn't need to, but on, for example, a hillscape like this, you know, collared bees going up the hill might be flying through the trunks. The bees coming down might be flying over the top of the canopy. So you do, at some point, you can't just rely on the bee line if the environment and the location doesn't allow. You need to adapt to that situation and physically watch your bee lines and look out for where they're going.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. There's something, sorry. I remember one time we had a line going up a steep meadow with, and it was a windy day. And there were trees lining that incline going up. And so the bees it was so beautiful. It was open space, yahoo. We all love open space. To watch bees fly. So what we could really, as we were walking up the hill, we would like almost on the same height as the bees, because they were only flying above 6 feet or so above ground level, but up the hill, and there was a straight line up. And then once we reached the ridge, it seemed as if the line was crossing the ridge and going somewhere into the woods on the other side of the ridge. And only by accident, we saw that once they reached the ridge, they made a sharp 90 turn to the right. So if you miss that moment, you spent the next 4 hours on the other side of the ridge trying to figure this out. So 90-degree turns do exist. And also, I want to come back to what Cheyanna was sharing. You know, later in the day, the sun is lower, and the way the sun shines is such a cool, it's so important to take that into consideration on which side is the sun when we watch bees fly, and do we have a darker black backdrop, which then enhances the sight of bees. Those are the most beautiful ideal conditions, where it's the sun is illuminating the space and we have a dark backdrop, and that just pops them up. And one at the end of what I want to share, one anecdote is we have one tree in a redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, at probably 70 feet or higher off the ground, with very dense canopy of other trees around. And it was just early in the morning, the sun was in the right position where we walked, and there were tiny patches of opening where the light could come through the canopy, and the light was shining onto that, I don't know how to call it, you know, where the bee line was condensing, it got closer to the entrance, and there were lots of bees in 70 feet up off the ground in that little island of light, of sunlight. And without the light at that time, we would have missed it so easily. So light is such an interesting element of beelining that is very important to consider.
Where did you, and this is purely technique talk here, but where did you view that? Obviously, you know, you saw it because of the light shining through. Did you see that from a distance? Like
no, I couldn't. It was too dense. I saw it maybe 40 feet away from the tree. I looked, the trees are very, very tall, those redwoods.
I want you to do something for me. This is a brilliant technique. When you're out, when you've got particularly high nests, when you've got them there 40, 50, 60 feet up, all trees are different. Here, I can tell you here that different trees exhibit nests in different locations. And for example, the horse chestnut conker trees don't often get them in the branches, but they will get them in the trunk. Generally, they have to be really old conker trees, horse chestnut trees. So the nests are quite high up. If you approach these trees, rather than trying to see them from a distance, because there's often a lot of foliage, like you're saying, you know, you would have, if it wasn't for the light, you'd have missed them. If you approach these trees straight up against the trunk and look up, because you will see through all the branches, you'll miss all the foliage, and you will see them flying in, like you did, that condensing point where they all get to the nest entrance, and you see it. It's a really, really good technique for seeing nest, especially when they're in the main trunk of the tree.
So that's so good. That's so good. And it wouldn't have worked there because once I got so close, I didn't see anything. I had to walk back again. So,
Well,
yeah.
So if I can just interrupt, we have about 15 more minutes. And you two, Cheyanna, you were talking about 8 to 10 inch diameter trees, and Joe, you're talking about moving up to the trunk itself and looking up. Are there best practices or takeaways or specific techniques that you can start sharing right now for our audience in case they want to start beelining? Because I think that, you know, all that you're talking about leads to these points, but if we could focus on things like what scent of the water, or, you know, you talked about water foragers, so you're going to streams and you're actually looking for them on the ground. But what might be some other practical techniques that would be useful for anybody who wants to try beelining?
If I was going to say, when you're approaching a location and you want to know where honeybees are, remember that they obviously forage on multiple things. So you can find them on leaves, trees collecting honeydew. You can find them collecting propolis. Here during late August time, they start gumming up their my hives and their nests. So you can see them collecting propolis. You'll see them collecting nectar, pollen, water. So there's, you know, you don't just have to go and look at a flower. You can look in multiple locations to see if there's honeybees. And as Tom was saying, you might be able to, if you're using your box, you might be able to pinch a propolis forager or a pollen forager and turn them into a nectar forager and get yourself started. So I think that might be a good start.
and I know for myself, there's also, you know, we're talking about these external practices to get started, the sense of centering and then really opening my senses to be paying attention to what's going on, and that more the living environment is a really key piece. And you know, Michaela and I have spoke about this on various times. It's kind of a tricky thing, fetching them in a box, or I've had conversations with folks who bring up the, you know, like, well, beelining, is it a little bit of trickery? And, you know, in some ways, when you fetch them in a box and are going through this process to have them reveal their home, it can seem that way. But one of the conversations we had that I really loved was, you know, just saying, hello, spirit of the bee, we're here, spirit of the forest and place. And we're about to engage in this practice, and with the bees even in the box, like, hey, do you want to play hide and seek with me? And this kind of invitation for their own agency, and whatever this mystery is that Michael happens to be just in the right spot at the right time with the right angle in which these revealing moments occur. Part of my inner technique is to give some acknowledgement or reverence to that and enter into this like landscape and field of play in which, yes, there's techniques, and it is this listening and observation and relational space. So there's some of my non-physical techniques that sometimes
No,
help.
you know what? That's brilliant. And to build from there is that we've got 5 senses. You don't just see them. You can smell nectar from low hives. You can hear them, and that's I found a nest just from hearing them last year, and I thought it was a swarm in a tree, and it wasn't. It was just a nest 20 foot above my head going like the clappers. You know, you've got multiple senses. You don't have to just rely, you know, on your box or, you know, one particular sense in your eyesight. You can hear, smell.
Yeah.
So
Can I
I want to
chime in
come
here,
back.
Steve?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm really glad you asked the question, Steve, about really how does this work? And it's a complicated process. And I don't think we can communicate it very well in just in this discussion. And that's actually why I wrote this book, Following the Wild Bees. And I'll just read the chapter titles because there's a lot of, it's quite tricky. There's a lot of technique. And I could never communicate it in a talk. But these are some of the chapter titles. Chapter 2, the bee box and other tools. So you have to get together your tools. The second chapter is the bee hunting season. You have to figure out what season works well when the bees really want to take food from a comb or whatever, or water. Step next is establishing a beeline. This is one of the trickier parts of the whole process. And then there's chapter 5, timing bees to estimate distance to home. And there's an art and a craft to that. And then chapter 6, making moves down the beeline. That's some of the part that's really hard. And then the last step, which we've been talking quite a bit about, is finding the bee tree. You've got yourself to the right general area. Then you have to find that little hole where the bees are going in. So it really is. Yeah, the reason I wrote this book is because there's so much technique to it. It's so much fun, but it can be frustrating unless you kind of know what you're doing and or have somebody show you how to do it. I didn't have either of those things, so I flub-dubbed around for years, actually.
I can only so agree with you, Tom. I mean, Cheyanna and I, when we started, we used your book. That was our little Bible. And it was just unbelievably beautiful. Just that you put this out into the world is such a gift and a huge resource. And the only other thing I could add to that is what we all 4 of us said earlier is to start, whatever your starting point is, with or without a box, just place yourself into the field and then follow. And then you will develop your own ways as well. And that's so important. I think it's very important to know all of our resources, but in the end, to be very open and not to limit ourselves to those. And then that will lead us to very different pathways.
Yeah.
And one last thing about water foragers. To work with water foragers is really a tremendous opportunity because of the proximity to the nest where they forage, and you can do it without any tools. And I would say here that they really prefer warmer water and water most likely in areas that are in sunlight, in sunshine, and not in the shade. That's why, at least in our area, puddles on roads are way warmer than any stream water is. Plus, there are other dimensions of mineral content and biotics and such things. But keep an eye out for sunny spots with puddles or slow running streams, or maybe shorelines that are just wet, or moss and things like that. And so, yeah. So that's
Could I raise a point? We're all quite successful at what we do. So we've all found multiple nests. We've all had days where we haven't found any nests. We've all had good days and bad days. But something that we often forget is that we're not just looking at one colony. Often, especially in forests or large natural areas, you're looking at a population, be it small or large. You're looking at a population. And I think as far as technique goes, if you're picking up on multiple lines, okay, that's one thing. But something that I found very, very helpful to me is the approach to the situation, approach to the area that you're then going to survey and to look at. And that is to consider that you're looking at a distributed population, and they're often at a level that's maintained, a density that's maintained by the forage predators, cavities, you know, whatever's available to them. And so there's often a structure. There'll often be, and I think a few scientists have found this, a set distance between them. So it's worth bearing in mind that if you found one colony, the potential is at a set distance from that location, there's going, not a specific set distance, but within, say, 200 to 400 meters, there's going to be another nest, because that's how they operate. But something I've also found is that you get familial clusters. So you'll have an area where there's high cavity availability, and you'll get 3 or 4 nests within a very close proximity, within anywhere from 20 to 50 meters of each other. And I think you need to remember that you're working with a population, that you're working with an environment that could allow abundance of nest cavities or abundance of colonies. So when you're in those areas, you really need to, okay, I've found one colony. I need to survey the immediate area, would say within 50 meters, check the trees. If you walk past one way without looking behind you, make sure you double back and walk back the other way. And that way you kind of cover a small location for any immediate family clusters that will be, or family, you know, colonies that will be in that immediate area. And then consider to yourself, okay, where am I going to move next? Because this colony is surviving well, it's likely swarmed. In which direction am I going to go from here? And how am I going to get away from that colony, coming down to my bee box and getting the nectar? How am I going to find, where am I going to have to move to get that next colony? So that's something to think about when you're beelining, when you're like I am hunting, how you go about it so that you're not just looking at the same colony, you know, you're able to move on to the next.
And you bring up a really good point, because all 4 of you are part of research projects. And it's using beelining as a tool to find where the nests are, but it's also monitoring to see whether they're surviving from year to year after the winters. You know, for Honeybee Watch, eventually we're going to be doing sampling of their genetics to test whether they are self-sustaining, whether they are actually wild, as opposed to escapees from a managed apiary close by. And then ultimately, it's about conservation. And Joe, when we were having, actually no, from the Arboreal Apiculture Salon number 30, you said something about conservation, not just of the bee populations, but of the trees themselves. Because these are habitats for not just the bees, but there are small mammals, there are birds, there are other organisms. So
whenever I get into a forest and I'm looking for bees, I'm not just looking for water, pollen, nectar, and propolis. And this came across in the last talk. You know, we put a nice sciencey label on it, ecological and environmental, you know, indicators. But I'm literally looking at nature and the animals that are interacting with honeybees and their nesting cavities. So the importance of this is, you know, you've got to preserve the tree. This is a forest management, you know, landscape degradation. This is incredibly important to preserve these trees because they take a long time to develop. Sometimes you can be lucky and have situations like we have here with the ash dieback producing a lot of cavities. But it takes a very, very long time for not only the cavity to develop, but also the nest, the comb, the propolis, everything else to develop. And you can often see cavities being reoccupied annually. And as far as technique goes, finding suitable and viable nest sites is very important for tracking colonies, because you can view them every spring. You can monitor their occupation, reoccupation, the survivorship within those colonies. You can beeline from them to see where there's another nest site. You can see their interaction with, you know, bats, birds, vespids. Last year was an absolute killer here for hornets, the European hornet. and a lot of the cavities were being co-occupied with European hornet and honeybees. And I dare say I lost several during the autumn, and I dare say that was to do with the impact of hornets. But that's how we need to think about this. It's not just about finding the honeybee. When you introduced me, you listed that I've got 130 plus nests, it's colonies that I found. It's not colonies, it's nest sites. Some years they're occupied, some years they die off and then are reoccupied the following year, or maybe wasps move in, maybe. And so when I'm out as part of my practice, I'm looking for my fastest ever nest discovery. Talking to a friend saying, oh, when I'm out, I look for squirrels. Look, there's a squirrel, there's honeybees. Boom, 2 seconds, I found a honeybee nest, because I was looking for an animal that interacts with honeybees. I've had squirrels kill off nests. So, we really need to be thinking when you're going out beelining, yeah, brilliant. Bees, learn about the bees and their environment, how they interact with the world outside of a hive, and get more personal with them in that way, but also the environment and the other organisms and creatures that they interact with. These things all are clues to where their nest sites could be.
And I love that comment, because it's really a great way to conclude. And I don't want to necessarily conclude right now, because it's been a great 70 minutes so far, but we're almost out of time. And before we start the Q&A, I invite you to wrap up or give takeaways or concluding remarks, and then we're going to open the floor to the Q&A. So if anybody has something to say in closing.
I'll jump in on that, just in terms of technique and resources to make note. There's several lists that kind of include all of the more immediate toolkit that would be the beelining box and the paint and all of those little doodads that usually can go inside of a backpack, and also a list that includes some larger tools that are good tools and tricks for the trade when you're going out, especially in rough terrain and that type of thing. Can often be hazardous, and I found a walking stick, as same with Joe, is very helpful. Water, be aware of the elements when you're out there. So that's all compiled in a list that was created. We also have a resource sheet of the data collection sheet that Apis arborea has put together for when you have a table and you're tracking them that way, that you can easily make notes of return times and things. So that is available. That we've sent it off to Steve to pass along to all of you.
Yes, and we'll actually send a follow-up email to everybody who is here today, as well as all the registrants who couldn't attend. And we'll have a link to the video recording, as well as some other resources. Chiara Benetti, who was one of the speakers from the Salon number 30, has been kind enough to share an infographic that she developed at Galway with Joe and Felipe. And I think we have other reference points as well that we'll share.
Yeah, and I would say, in terms of closing notes, outside of the technique, and is more this, I hope that you've come away with something from this session, to where that you can enter into the landscape wherever you're at and begin to have a conversation with the wild and all of the various creatures, and the bees being a part of them, and find some nests and be delighted, and all of the whole spectrum.
I'd just like to add that don't be constrained. Really approach whatever environment that you're going into with fresh eyes. Be guided by some amazing scientific literature, some brilliant books by Tom. His new one's going to be out soon. Go and buy it. But be guided by those things, but don't be restrained. Understand that your environment could offer up new possibilities. There could be different interactions where you are with different animals, different flora, fauna. These are all things for you to learn and adapt to how you find honeybees. So yeah, really approach with fresh eyes and a notion that you're there to learn something, and take a stick. Sticks are important.
And toilet paper.
And toilet paper. Always remember the toilet paper.
Mikhail or Tom?
I'll be the caboose. Tom, you go.
Oh, I don't really have any summary thought except to say that it is, to emphasize the fact that when you're bee hunting, you're having a very different relationship to honeybees than when you're doing beekeeping. And I think that's for me the main message I'd like to convey to people today, that this is an alternative and somewhat more much more revealing activity, much more revealing about the behavior of worker honeybees than you will get in looking at a whole hive as a beekeeper.
Thank you for that, Tom. And I think my final thoughts are along those lines as well, that what comes up for me is that we talk about a way to enter a different kind of cosmology, the cosmology of the wild, a cosmology that is promoting and featuring resilience and health. It's a cosmology within which we can observe a wild animal in indigenous environments. It's an apian wild cosmology, or wild apian cosmology, within which we can kind of allow to be reconditioned through exposure and experience and work and building relationship within a world that is of a very unique, different kind. And then comparing that against an industrial cosmology, an industrial apian cosmology that here in the US has produced mortality rates, annual mortality rates between 50 and 70%. And no one is marching on the streets to raise awareness for this, but this is the new normal. And also, anyway, that makes me very emotional. But we see them as two different kind of realities, really. One that is leading to the suffering of this being, and beekeepers are one huge driver that has contributed to the suffering. And then we have the wild, this cosmology of the wild that carries an innocence and a vast, unlimited opportunity for us to learn, and to learn in the wild, and then walk back into the apiary and change our ways of being with honeybees. And I want to say one last thing by quoting Naomi Klein, author, activist. Some of you may have heard about her. And she's very much talking about climate emergency and the fact that we have entered the 6th mass extinction in the world. And she said, we have arrived at a point where there is no non-radical option left for us to pick up. So those are my last words.
Thank you, all of you. You have made my job so easy. I had all of these notes as to the flow of the day, and you just naturally wove a web that was insightful, that was entertaining, that was really great. So I appreciate all of you participating here today. I think people have learned a lot, and I see that a slew of questions have come into the chat. And so I would like to pass the moderation to Rigo.
Yeah. So first of all, I have to say to everybody, thank you very much. I think I speak for everybody here listening. We still have 51 participants still with us. So this is very such a great audience to have. And thank you very much actually for the knowledge that you share, and to be such a, such an entertaining, this was such an entertaining conversation. So thank you very much for this. So now Steve actually have tasked me with the unfortunate task of keeping in time. So You know, as an Italian, I'm not that good with that, so I'll try my best. But the idea usually is that we have a session of like half an hour, 20 minutes to close. But I would really like to keep in time, so I would just try to keep a 20-minute Q&A session. And to do that, would like to just give the floor to one of the people who actually asked the question here during the chat, but also then I'm gonna follow up with the questions that I've grouped together, depending on the different topics, so to make things easier for you guys to actually reply to that. So I see, Keith, I see you actually asked a few questions. Do you want to maybe unmute yourself? Since you probably yeah, I can see you.
Thanks, Enrico. And thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed that. It was a really nice chat and backwards and forwards. And if people take nothing away from today other than to consider honeybees holistically in terms of where they sit in nature, then I think they'll be doing well. I was asking loads of questions, including whether or not the line followed Mikhail or whether or not it was going in the opposite direction. Thankfully, it was going the opposite direction. One of my questions was already answered, so I'm going to leave that regarding whether or not the bees always went in a straight line or turned left or right. So I'm going to stick with, what's the greatest distance away from an initial capture site do you think you could actually track to a nest? Are we talking a kilometer? Are we talking more than that? That's something that interests me. How far can you actually work out from an initial capture site of a bee or bees?
In my experience, it can be a couple of kilometers, several kilometers. I think the longest was probably 3 kilometers in my experience, one and a half miles basically across a river.
I wouldn't be able to comment if I'm honest. The forests are quite densely populated, so it's hundreds of meters at best for me.
Yeah, Joe, you've got a fairly unique situation there, right?
Yeah,
you've got a very high density of colonies. And actually, I'm going to be cheeky, Enrico. I'm going to just squeeze in my second question, which was if you actually had an idea of how many colonies were within foraging distance of a particular forage source. So for instance, let's say you could use something like environmental DNA pulled from a water source or pulled from a floral source to be able to indicate how many colonies, different colonies might be within foraging distance. Would you use it or would it spoil the fun?
Yeah, totally. Definitely.
I would do it.
You would do it. See if you could get 100%
concept. It's a beautiful concept. I was not aware of that idea. It's a beautiful idea.
Yeah,
sounds like a good way to get the abundance of colonies, but it wouldn't work in the course of a hunt because the delay of getting the results.
It'd be very useful for conservation to give an idea of density, especially if it was quick and easy and you're able to use it multiple times a year. You could possibly check, density, expansion, contraction, over a season, over years, which I think would be helpful in understanding because, I've done a lot of surveying, 4 years on the job, and I still don't think I've found I know I haven't found every nest site on every colony, so it could be helpful in that respect.
Joe, yours are probably replicating and swarming faster than you can find them, no matter how good you are.
But that's a good thing, actually.
Right, I will get off the floor and leave it open to other people. Thank you very much for the answers. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Keith, actually. I just grouped together also 2 questions one from John and one from Nina that were actually asking a few details regarding the marking of the bees. So John was actually asking if there is any electronic tags that could be used, any way of tagging bees that could be different from marking them manually with color. While Nina was actually asking what is the safest paint to be used for marking bees with color. So if you can expand on that.
Yeah, for the paint part, I can't on the second part, but that one, Mikhail and I have looked for a non-toxic watercolor paint. Some of the basic paints are non-toxic for kids, but then, it's been an ongoing kind of research to see if we can really make sure that the components in the paint are safe for bees as well. Is there a particular brand that we've landed on, Mikhail, for that, or just mainly looking for one that at least has the non-toxicity standards? And that's a watercolor paint that we're using.
We're using watercolors that are branded non-toxic. They're made for children. However, some of them have still heavy metals in them. And we have started exploring to work with natural pigments. And that is also not so straightforward because some natural pigments are just more subdued in colors, and we need something more bright and flashy. So we haven't landed there yet on a really final call.
And what about sorry.
I was just going to say, definitely nothing that's an oil-based paint in terms of marking them, but something water soluble. I can't comment on the electronic side of things. I'm not the techie one.
So how about you? Okay, so maybe Keith may have, I know from his expertise that actually he may have something that could be answered here.
Yeah, there's one possibility, which is to use RFIDs. So the same things that stop you sort of stealing items out of supermarkets. They're stuck in products. They're very, very small, and they go through the scanner at the entrance to the supermarket or shop, and they set off a beep. There are some that are purportedly small enough to stick onto a bee. It requires a bit of a reader, and it requires a bit of software, so it's an expensive option. But it is possible to do. It's something that a few people are looking at. There's actually one chap a PhD student in Egypt who's looking at this idea to track queens to see how far they fly in various different types of weather. And basically it's attached onto the queen. She flies out, and when she comes, it marks the exit time and the return time, which is kind of really what you're interested in when you're beeline. So there's a possibility of using a more automated electronic method.
I do remember now, we did speak with someone from UC Davis. That's a local university in California, not so far away from us. I spoke with someone there who put me in contact with someone else. And it sounds like, first of all, it's expensive. Those sensors, they have to be also, well, multiple things. It starts with ethics, animal ethics. Those transponders would have to be glued onto a bee, and they would never come back off. And that's its own little field of inquiry. And then in dense forestry or underbrush, transmission rates are probably not so good. And it needs then big equipment to pick up radio frequency, being transmitted back. So that would be a huge investment. But on that note, something that we sometimes come back to is the question of using drones. Drones with the right kind of camera that could follow possibly lines that we started. And I know someone in the chat asked, what do you do if a line goes above the canopy and disappears out of sight? And that is kind of where we wonder whether a drone would be applicable there.
And you actually,
if I can add here, I think it would be, at least for me, it would be hard to rely on having a little chip on the bee and then having to use a reader to identify that chip, because I'm watching a bunch of bees on the comb and I want to know, I see a bee fly away. I want to be able to know who that is without any intervention. I just want to see it. That's yellow thorax, for example. So I think in the context of bee hunting, unlike the context of monitoring bees flying in and out of a hive, I think in the context of bee hunting, the simpler is probably the better. The simpler for us to see and identify the code of a bee, the color mark or whatever it is.
Yeah, I've heard the same opinion also for other use for those devices, RFIDs. For example, with Vespa velutina, it's been used a similar technique for identifying where the nest is. And usually what you do is you could capture a few hornets in the apiary where they are attacking bees. You place those sensors there and then you basically follow it. But it appears not to be very, very effective, and it's definitely not, it's very costly. That's also another thing that I understood. So, yeah.
Sorry, Ria. Yeah, Tom, I'm inclined to agree with you. I would stick with the simpler option. I threw it out there because people asked about it, but I don't think it would add anything to bee lining.
So I just
other than a more precise time.
I just want to interrupt for people who don't know who Keith is.
I was just saying the same.
He works in the Galway Honeybee Research Center, and he's one of the kind of leaders of Honeybee Watch. So he is very knowledgeable about free-living bees. Just
Thanks, Keith. And thanks, Mika. Actually, you also already answered the question that I was asking right after this one, which was asking about what do you do when bees fly up in the canopy and you actually cannot follow them. So maybe drones using some technology even there could be helpful, but probably you are exploring. I understood that you are exploring as a possibility. Other ways that you guys either, Joe or Tom, think of trying to answer that question, or finding a way to detect where the bees will go, or can you predict where they will go once they get into a patch of woods and they go very high and you cannot see them anymore?
Yeah, that is a real problem, but the solution is usually just to set up your little feeder comb in a place where there's enough opening it's a large enough opening so that when the bee flies away, she may have to circle upward, but usually you can see the bee leaving the opening when she gets above the treetops, going off in a particular direction. It takes good eyesight, but but that's how it can be done that way. That's what I've done.
It's if you have bees collecting pollen, that helps because they're more there's more to them. You can see them a little bit easier, especially if it's nice and bright. But generally, if bees are flying up and over the canopy, they will tend to head in a straight line because there's nothing in their way. So, as long as you can see where they're going at that point, you get a rough guide, of the direction. As opposed to when they're flying around in the forest, they'll be up and down, left and right, and all over. So yeah, that's about all I can contribute to that.
So just would repositioning yourself so that the sun is behind them, would that help, or in front of them? Because you want the glint on the wings, which will potentially reveal where they are, right?
You don't have to just have the glint on the wings. If you can get them up against a cloud, they're a black dot. If you've got a pair of binoculars, you can watch them go. Whatever works. If you've got the ropes or good upper body strength, climb a tree and get a better view. So I wouldn't advise anybody do anything too dangerous, but I'm just saying you can adapt a little bit to that situation.
Sounds
And
good.
I think
Yeah, Cheyanna, sorry.
just that there's such nuance with each day and what the climate is. Is it windy? Is it sunny? Is there a cloud backdrop? These are the places where that, listening in the moment and trying to see in what way they're going to reveal themselves. It's a very living, engaged process that you know, we can suggest, but then get out there and try it out and be delighted and be frustrated and all the in between.
It's nature. It's not. This isn't an exact science. As you mentioned, everything can be different, you know, on a different day. And all we are trying to do is give the best tips and hints as to how you can increase your probability of finding that nest site. You know,
Oh, I'm sorry. Don't mean to interrupt.
it's okay.
I was just going to say that in my experience, the first time a bee leaves your feeding station, she circles around because you've introduced her to the feeding station. She didn't come to that feeding station. So the first time she goes home, she does a lot of circling and orienting. But then as she gains experience traveling from your comb back to her home, she goes off on a very clear line. And so just if you're patient with a bee, usually they make their direction quite more and more clear as they gain more experience coming and going from the comb.
So the question, probably the answer to the question is get more experience out of this. So trying to get into the field and understand that.
Yeah, and not beating up on yourself if you can't see the direction the bee is flying home on her first couple of trips home. Just keep trying, and sooner or later things will work out. You'll see the bee against the blue sky, the dark bee against the blue sky, and you'll see where she's going.
You know, more and more. Sorry.
You might have a, you know, moment of being blinded by the sun or get dizzy as you're twisting around and doing this, but you know, it's all part of it, right? We have to get woven into their tapestry.
And so, you know, the more and more I listen about this, I hear about this, it sounds more like frustration training than finding bees, you know. Sounds more that sort of training.
Well, these guys have got infinite amounts more patience than I have. I couldn't sit still. I have to run around. I couldn't do it.
Well, what I was going to say is, to what degree is it fun?
I mean, for
It's
me,
fun.
any excuse getting out in nature and watching bees and it being in the landscape, I mean, there's the fun right there. And it's incredible. I mean, yes, it's got its challenges and the weather and the climate and conditions and wildlife and all of that. And at the same time, it's so alive and real, and getting to have an experience as a human these days that isn't sitting in front of our electronic boxes in our pre-created environments, and being touched by that in any way and getting curious about it. That's the fun to me. I mean, who wants to be chased by pigs in the morning, or, you know, the possibility, it's like I'm alive, right? You know, or chase the pigs, as it turns out.
Do the other bee hunters here feel a kind of exaltation too when you find the bee tree? It's a real high. It's a real sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. And I make it competitive sometimes. If I go out with other people or my kids, you know, there'll be £10 on who finds the next nest, and you know, things like that. We just adds another layer.
That's definitely
it totally
helps
does.
with the
Yeah, especially when you're like right almost there, and then the next person in the crew's like, "Oh, I found him." You're like, "Oh,
yeah."
That's definitely, like, the £10 probably help a lot with frustration training, especially for kids.
Don't let Keith know about that. He'll turn up.
So we're basically close to the end, and so I would like to close the Q&A section here. But just one thing that I would like to mention here, that I see there are also 2 questions by Adia and Nina. That Adia was actually asking, I wonder, once you find actually a bee colony, what do you do with that? Where is actually the project going after you find a bee? So if I may able to ask a question, you probably going to be able to know more about that if you look at our old symposia from the from last year. If I remember, it was in April. It's the first one. It's the one about monitoring, and we had actually the pleasure to have Tom also there. So we cover quite a lot of topics of, let's say, different details regarding the monitoring. I don't know where you're based, Adia, but there are different initiatives around Europe that are actually collecting data, monitoring colonies. Hopefully, we're going to be able to let you know about our initiative that we'll be able to, start at the end of this year, hopefully, and maybe even sooner than that. At the moment, we have a reporting website, so a web app that you can find on our on app.honeybeewatch.com. I'm sure probably Steve will add more details into that, and I can also paste the links into the chat here. So I would say that we can close the section here. A big thank you to all of you, especially the panelists, for giving us a lot of thought of food for thought. What they say, a lot of way of thinking about this. So thanks a lot, and so I hope I'm on time, Steve. I hope I'm gonna. We are in time.
Perfect.
So
You're perfect. So before we
much.
conclude.
We've been training him in Ireland, Steve. That's why.
So in the last minute or so, I just want to say thank you again. This has been really enjoyable. I just love seeing the dynamics between you guys. So much information going back and forth, so much knowledge that you all hold, and we are so grateful that you have shared it with us. I just want to plug the rest of our series. In June, we will be talking about tree cavities. We have Mick from Boom Tree Bees, Kevin Smith from the United States Forest Service, and Barbara Jazedel from Warsaw University, who's been studying the organisms that cohabitate log hives. In September, we're going to ask, are wild honeybees wild bees too? And then in December, we'll talk about how to communicate and recruit for citizen science, because at Honeybee Watch, one of the ways for us to expand is by establishing these regional cells around the world. We're talking to people in Portugal, in Kenya, in Zambia, elsewhere. And if you want to put together a regional team of scientists and beekeepers and citizens who can help and participate, that's a way for you to understand how to organize yourselves. So that's it. That takes us to the top of the hour. Thank you for everybody who continued to stay with us until the end of our 2 hours. And once again, thank you to Tom, Michael, Cheyanna, and Joe, and Arrigo, you too. So,
you're welcome.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Very
for having.
welcome.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, that was fun.
thank you very much.
Till the next
everyone.
time.
See you.